If there's one thing that this year has really shown us, it's that the unexpected can and will happen, and we need to be prepared for it. That's definitely something that I've learned over the past 11 months of this year, and it's something I'm sure you've also learned and seen too. With that being said, in today's video, what I really want to do is dive into what an emergency fund is, why it's so important to have one, and how you can know how much you need to have in your emergency fund. So if that's something of interest to you, you want to know all about emergency funds, you've heard it bandied around so much, you've heard people talking about an emergency fund, a rainy day fund, and you want to know what they're talking about and why it's so important, then you're going to want to stay tuned and watch this video. Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new around here, thanks for stopping by. My name's Tolu, and on this channel I share content all around personal finance, budgeting, frugal living, and I show you how to live your best life on a budget. In today's video guys, I'm going to be talking about a word that's bandied around so much in the personal finance space online, and I'm sure you've heard about it too, and it's that subject called emergency funds. So first of all, let's start with what an emergency fund actually is. So I'm going to consult my favorite Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is obviously the most reliable source on the internet, but I do like their definition of emergency fund. An emergency fund, also known as a contingency fund, is a personal budget set aside as a financial safety net for future mishaps or unexpected expenses. A critical part of financial planning, it is supposed to ensure one's personal finances are prepared for an emergency so that the risks of becoming dependent on credit, falling into debt, or running out of money in general are reduced if such a situation were to occur. So I love that definition of an emergency fund, and it sums it up beautifully, and it says it in better words than I would say it. But that's literally what an emergency fund is in a nutshell. It's a pot of cash which you set aside to deal with any unforeseen expenses. So rainy days are going to come. That is inevitable. Things are going to happen which are beyond your control, which you wouldn't have planned for, which you wouldn't have expected. But we need to be prepared in the event that these things arise. And that's where an emergency fund comes into play. But why do we need an emergency fund? The fact is that emergencies will arise, things are going to happen, things are going to need your money, they are going to need your time and attention. So what are you going to do when these instances arise? I think one of the beauties of an emergency fund is it protects you from falling back into debt. So if you've become debt free and you've paid off all your debt, having an emergency fund will mean that if unforeseen circumstances occur which are not in your favor, you can be prepared to deal with that without having to get into any new debt, or if you're already in debt, it will stop you from going further deeper into debt. So an emergency fund, I see it as a safety blanket. It's that safety net. So I think another great benefit of it is that it gives you that peace of mind and gives you that bit of a cushion and a comfort blanket to deal with any uncertain situations that may arise. So for example, let's say God forbid you lost your job today, how long will you be able to survive before getting into debt? That's where an emergency fund will come into play. So if you have a 1 month emergency fund saved, then that means you'll be okay for 1 month. If you have a 2 month emergency fund saved, that means you'll be okay for 2 months. And obviously the bigger your emergency fund and the more months you have your emergency fund saved for, the more cushion that you have and the more of a safety net you have, and the more time you have to really think, plan and strategize your next move. I think another beauty of an emergency fund is that emergencies, when you have an emergency fund, they stop being emergencies, and more often than not, they just become inconveniences. So yes, it is a setback. Yes, it's annoying that this has arisen, but it's not the end of the world. I can still get through this. So if I give an example of myself, earlier this year, our car broke down. No, our car didn't break down. I crashed it and I ripped the car off. So we no longer had a vehicle. So what that meant is that we needed to buy a new car. Now, thank God we had an emergency fund saved up at that time. It wasn't at a 6 months where it is now, but we had a 3 month emergency fund saved at that time. So what that meant is that when I writ off the car, we had money set aside that we could use to buy a new car. Now, my new car isn't no fancy car. It's not the range that I would love it to be, but it is a reliable car. It gets us from A to B, and I'm able to continue with life because I have a car in which to drive. So what that meant is that when that emergency arose, we didn't have to get into extra debt in order to buy that car. We were able to use money that we had set aside for an emergency situation like that one that arose. If we didn't have an emergency fund in place at that time, I don't actually know what we would have done, to be honest. I think I would have just had to take that L for another few months until we could save up enough money to buy some sort of a vehicle. So that's the beauty of an emergency fund. Yes, it was inconvenient having to dip into that money to buy a new car, but thank God we had that money to dip into in the first place. So that's the beauty of an emergency fund, and that's how beneficial it can be. It can literally turn a catastrophe into a more manageable situation just by being prepared in advance for it. So an emergency fund is for things that are an emergency and things that you didn't see coming. So if your car insurance is up for renewal, that doesn't count as an emergency because you knew that that was coming. Your insurance runs out every single year and it needs to be replenished and repaid for on a yearly basis. Even to an extent, I would argue that a flat battery on a car doesn't count as an emergency either, because at the end of the day, you should know that these things wear and tear, and eventually you're going to need to replace the battery in the car after some time. So that kind of thing, you could start setting money aside throughout the year to put towards a sinking fund in order to pay for that new battery. Or likewise, if it was the car tire that went flat, put money aside so that you can pay for things like that. Those kind of things your sinking fund should cover. So if you don't know what sinking funds are, then definitely watch this video up there where I talk all about sinking funds and the type of sinking funds that you can have in place. And I think things like home maintenance, car maintenance, those can all be covered under sinking funds. But when we talk about emergencies, I think emergency funds should be set aside specifically for things that occur that we can't foresee coming and that we couldn't have prepared for. A medical bill. So yes, in the UK we're fortunate to have free healthcare through the NHS, but things may arise where you don't have time to wait for that NHS appointment and you need to be seen to right now, in which case you would want to go private. You may not have private medical healthcare, in which case you will need to just use that emergency fund to have the matter seen to. Things that are just beyond your control, things that you didn't foresee coming and need to be paid for urgently, those are the kind of things that I would say the emergency fund is designed for. Obviously, job loss is a big one, and that's a big reason why we want emergency fund, and that's probably the main thing in which the emergency fund should be for. It's for job loss, it's for loss of income, reduction in income. So obviously this year people were furloughed from work, so you've had your income drop from 100% to an 80% drop, and in some cases like myself were even made redundant, so lost your job completely. These are situations and scenarios where an emergency fund really comes into play and is really needed, and it's really impactful and effective. So if you don't have an emergency fund in place, now is really the time to start thinking about how you can start saving money to put towards an emergency fund. I appreciate that everyone's financial situation is very, very different. Some people, like myself, have been made redundant this year, in which case your priority is just surviving. Your priority is not trying to build an emergency fund. How are you building an emergency fund if you barely have any income coming in? Judge it by where you currently are and your current financial position at the moment. But if you are in employment and you do have an income coming in consistently and you don't have any kind of emergency fund in place, now's the time to really consider starting one and starting to put money aside towards that goal. In terms of things that don't count as emergency, birthdays, Christmas, holidays, anniversaries, these things are not emergencies, and these are not things that you need to be dipping into the emergency fund to pay for. I know it can be tempting, especially once you've saved up a certain amount. When you see £1,000, £2,000, £3,000 put aside in the savings account that you can dip into at any time, the temptation can be there to think, okay, let me just use that money to quickly pay for this Christmas present, or let me quickly use this money to pay for this birthday gift. But try not to do that if you can, because the emergency fund is really that. It's set aside for things that are emergencies. It's not set aside for things that you haven't budgeted for and planned for properly. It's important to note here that when you do spend money from your emergency fund, it's important to replenish that money. So any money that you do spend, make sure you put it back. So when we bought our car earlier this year, what we had to do is pause and stop all our mortgage overpayments and concentrate on bulking our emergency fund back up. And at that time, what we decided is to increase it from a 3-month emergency fund to a 6-month emergency fund. So that meant it took even longer to save up that emergency fund. But because of all of what's been happening this year, the uncertainty with employment, me losing my job, we were like, nah, do you know what? We need to be secure as we possibly can within our own abilities and capabilities. So yeah, definitely when you dip into that emergency fund, make sure you put it back. So when building up an emergency fund, it's important to note what our needs versus wants, because I think a lot of the time when we're budgeting, a lot of things that are wants, we convince ourselves are needs. But when it comes to an emergency fund, an emergency situation, now you're in survival mode. Now you're in, okay, I just need to do what I need to do in order to get through this situation. Now's the time to really strip back and really reduce all those expenses and get your budget down to the bare minimum. So when you're thinking of an emergency fund, it needs to be based on your bare minimum living expenses for the next 3 to 6 months, however long you want your emergency fund to be for. So when calculating how much you need to have in an emergency fund, you first need to establish how long you want your emergency fund to cover you for. So do you want a 3-month emergency fund, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months? Everyone does what works for them, and everyone does things differently depending on their financial situation and their tolerance and their appetite for risk. So for some people, 3 months they're fine, they're confident that within 3 months they can get themselves back on their feet, they can get another job. Depending on the kind of job you do and the kind of industry you're in as well, that will determine the kind of emergency fund you'll need. If you're a CEO of an organization, for example, you're going to want a 6 to 12 month emergency fund at the least, because you know that CEO positions, they don't come around often, they don't come around every day. You're not going to be getting a new job just like that, because those kind of roles, you know from experience, your CEO at the company you're in right now, how long have they been in that role for? Usually it's 5, 10, 15 years. So if that's the case, then you know the people don't move around that much. So you need to know that, okay, it's going to take me a long while to get another job. Whereas if you have a more junior role, a more introductory role, it might be that you can get a job a lot quicker. Or even if you can't get a job in the field in which you're experienced, you know that even if you get a different job doing something else, the income will still be similar to the income that you're used to getting. But if you're used to getting £7,000, £8,000 a month, you can't just go and get a £2,000 a month job. It's not going to be affordable for you given the expenses in which you currently have. Look at your situation, be honest with yourself, have this conversation with yourself, work out the length of time in which you'll be comfortable with as your emergency fund, and then work back. So once you've established that you want to build a 6-month emergency fund, now we need to do the maths. If you have a budget, then this will be an easy task, and if you don't have a budget, you're going to need to take a step back and create a budget, in which case watch this video up here where I give you a beginner's guide to budgeting, in which it tells you how to create a budget and the importance of a budget, etc. Because once you have a budget and you know exactly how much it costs to be you, then this task of creating an emergency fund will be a lot easier. But if you don't know what your expenses are, you don't know what your outgoings are, then it's going to be very hard for you to work out exactly how much you need for your emergency fund. So the first things first is, once you have a budget and you know exactly how much your monthly costs are, then you can just do the maths and work out how much you need for your emergency fund. So for example, if your expenses right now are £2,000 a month, but you know that £500 of those expenses, if you needed to, you can remove them at the drop of a hat, then you would want to do your budget based on the £1,500 instead of the £2,000, because we know that those £500 non-essentials, if I need to, I can remove them and I'll be okay. So non-essentials will be things like your subscriptions, even your food bill. You can reduce that from £300 to £150 if you know you're on a tight budget. So once you know the minimum cost of living, how much it's going to cost you to live on a tight budget for a month, take that number and then multiply it by 3 if it's 3 months, multiply it by 6 if it's 6 months, etc, etc. Depending on how long you want your emergency fund for will determine how much you need to times your monthly budget by. So if you're saying 1,500 is your bottom line expenses for the month, times that by 3 and it will be £4,500 you need in your emergency fund. I think that's right. If you have a spouse or significant other, it would be good to do this exercise together as a team to really look at your budget, look at how much you currently are earning, how you can find ways to reduce your expenses in order to accelerate those payments towards your emergency fund, because now's the time to really get serious when it comes to our finances. And if you don't have an emergency fund in place and you're currently in a position where you're earning an income, I strongly suggest you really start considering ways to start accelerating your savings so that you can build this emergency fund and you can get some kind of a safety net and a cushion in place, because the last thing we want is for life to happen and for it to hit even harder because we don't have an emergency fund in place. Losing your job is hard enough without having to worry about the financial implications of losing that job at the same time. But yeah, in this video what I wanted to do is really bring you an explanation of emergency funds, why we're always talking about it in the personal finance space, and how beneficial it can be to you on your financial journey. So I hope I've sold it to you, and I hope you're really raring to go and really excited about building your emergency fund. In my next video, what I'm going to do is really share with you steps that you can take and things you can do to really get that emergency fund going, things that you can do in order to save your emergency fund as quickly as possible. So if you're not yet subscribed to my channel, then you're going to want to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss that video, because it's going to be really helpful and beneficial to you. But with that being said, guys, that's literally it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for another video. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.